Thank you for tuning in to the latest edition of the 12 Kyle podcast. Whether you're listening during your commute, while working out, or just relaxing at home, we appreciate you. Every download, every listen, and every subscription means a lot. Up next, the 12 Kyle podcast.
89% of business leaders say AI is a top priority. But with AI tools popping up everywhere, how do you separate the helpful from the hype? The right choice is crucial, which is why teams at 1/3 of Fortune 500 companies use Grammarly. With over 15 years of experience building responsible, secure AI, Grammarly isn't just another AI communication assistant. It's how companies like yours increase productivity while keeping data protected and private. Designed to fit the needs of business, Grammarly is backed by a user-first privacy policy and industry-leading security credentials. This means you won't have to worry about the safety of your company information. Grammarly also emphasizes responsible AI, so your company can avoid harmful bias. See why 70,000 teams and 30 million people trust Grammarly at Grammarly.com/enterprise. That's Grammarly.com/enterprise. Grammarly, enterprise-ready AI.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. Thank you for downloading. And thank you for subscribing to the latest edition of the 12 Kyle podcast. I am your boy, 12 Kyle. Man, check this out. On this episode, what I'm going to do is wrap up 2024. Now, at the time of this recording, I think it's safe to say, let me be the first, if not the last, to wish you a happy new year. May 2025 be filled with joy, good health, blessings, prosperity, and everything that is good. 2024 was a year. For some, it was a great year. For others, it wasn't so much. But at the end of the day, was it really a bad year if you got a chance to see the year? You feel me? So nonetheless, if you've been following the podcast, you know, each year I normally get on at the end of the year and tell you like 12 dope things that I did in that particular year, in going with the theme of the 12. This year I want to do something a little different. As many people like myself who are people who listen to music and listen to podcasts via the stream Spotify, provides what they call the Spotify Wrapped. And the Wrapped, or the Wrap Up, if you will, basically breaks down your numbers as Spotify keeps data on you, and they track you for all of the music and podcasts that you listen to, and the times that you listen to it, and the songs that you listen to, and the artists that you listen to. Now, it would have been much easier for me to be like everybody else and screenshot a couple of these things and put them up on my IG and keep it moving. But I wanted to kind of put it in perspective just for my listeners of this podcast and people who watch on YouTube. Thank you for watching. I appreciate it. As far as the podcast was concerned, and myself included, 2024 was a pretty good year. It had its ups and its downs, but I will say this: the highs were definitely higher than the lows, and there were more highs than lows. I'll say that. But for the podcast, it was a banner year for us. The podcast actually grew in size. It grew in perspective because I grew as far as perspective is concerned. And I think I got better as a podcaster throughout the year. As many of you know, maybe some of you know, most of 2024, I was battling issues with my sinuses. And I finally went to an ear, nose, and throat doctor that told me, like, hey, 12 Kyle, you're basically allergic to every tree in America. So you have to proceed with caution. So from that day that I went to the allergy doctor and took this test, where they gave me 39 shots in one arm, real talk. After that, what they did was they prescribed for me a pill, an allergy pill that I take daily. Other than that, I'm fine. So if you listen to any of my episodes in 2024, and going back to 2023, I think too as well, you'll hear sometimes that I sound a little nasally. I've gotten used to the sound. It's just the way that I'm going to sound probably going from here on out. It's not really that big of a deal now. The issue for me was just the coughing, because I would be coughing like none other. But finally, once I realized and found out that, what I was allergic to, I could kind of, tweak things. But the post nasal drip was very annoying. Waking up in the morning coughing, waking up having to blow my nose 11 times became a lot. So I overcame that and still was able to produce a weekly podcast. And what I mean by the podcast growing was, we have a new baby, and you'll hear about it much later in the podcast. If you haven't heard so already, it's called the Rap Soul Podcast. We launched it a couple of months ago. Rap Soul Podcast is the intersection where we talk about rap and soul music from the 80s, 90s, and the 2000s. It is a music podcast. It is the best music podcast that you've never heard. You want to check it out. I'll tell you a little later about where you can find it. But the Rap Soul Podcast is dope. I got that off the ground, and it's been a lot of fun thus far. I was kind of tinkering, and still am kind of tinkering with the days I'm going to release it, because normally it's been Mondays. I've released it a couple of Sundays. Going back and forth as to whether or not I want to do that or not. Also going back and forth whether or not I want to continue with Sunday episodes of this, or just do bonus episodes. That way I'm not, bound to an episode every Sunday. It's one of those things I'm trying to figure out. We introduce commercials. As you can hear, advertisements on here. Definitely listen to the advertisements. I'm always interested, because I didn't realize these ads really kind of find you wherever you are. So if you're in Kalamazoo, Michigan, you may hear an ad that's related to Kalamazoo, Michigan. But it's been fun, and finally getting some compensation for the podcast. It's not enough to quit my job. I'm not a billionaire podcaster like my boys Baylor or Dolomite or King Germ or Eclectic. So I got like $7, so that's good. So I can get lunch, maybe. But the podcast grew over the year, and like I said, I think I got better as a podcaster. Definitely had more people on, which I always enjoy, and especially for the Rap Soul Podcast, I'm looking to bring on. I reached out to a lot of fellow podcasters, and when I announced that I was doing the podcast, and I told them, I was like, "Hey, I'm going to have you on." So if I haven't reached out to you since then, trust me, I hadn't forgotten about you. I genuinely have a lot of respect and admiration for my fellow podcasters. So I definitely, particularly the ones who know and can talk music, you'll definitely be on. There's no doubt about that. We also hit a milestone in the podcast as well. The 12 Kyle podcast hit episode 600 in this past November. So that was dope. I really, really appreciated all the love that came through for that one. You don't ever set out doing a podcast and say, "Hey, I'm going to, do 600 episodes," because the reality is most people, a lot of podcasters don't get past episode 10. People get frustrated. They buy all this equipment and they see that it's not coming to fruition, and, they kick it to the curb. This is a labor of love, and it's something that I enjoy doing. So I'm contracted in. So, until I'm done with the contract, then I'll, whenever I feel like I don't have anything else to say, whatever time that happens, then that's when I'll move on to something else. But right now you got the podcast. But anyway, getting back to the wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that I listened to and the podcast and numbers and stuff like that. So the first thing I want to talk about is the Spotify wrap up said basically fans were really loving your show in 2024. Duh. But I thank you all. And shout out to, there's a lot of you, and I really wasn't aware of this as much until I started looking at numbers. But there are a lot of you who listen to this podcast and you never comment on social media. You never send a tweet. You never comment on Instagram or YouTube or anything like that. But you listen faithfully, and I want to say thank you. I had somebody hit me up on TikTok the other day, and I don't know who it is because their name isn't like a name that's known. And they said, "I'm a fan of the podcast. I listen all the time." And I've never had any interactions with them, but I thank them for it. I mean, I think there's probably more people like that I'm really aware of. And looking at numbers, I really became more aware of it. But shout out to y'all. Shout out to y'all. One of the things that Spotify let me know that my top episode was three-peat Jodeci with Autumn the Aries. First of all, shout out to Autumn the Aries from the Lit Life podcast. One of my favorites. Autumn has been on here several times. I've been on her podcast as well. Looking forward to having Autumn on the Rap Soul podcast so we can talk a little R&B. She's a big fan. Autumn is dope, man. Autumn is dope. And I remember having this, it was a three-peat talking about Jodeci, which is one of our favorite groups. And if you know Autumn, you know she loves some Jodeci. The thing that I found that was interesting about that episode was like, you know, I really, really, really love Jodeci's first album. I really liked the second album. Third album, not so much. And I think that was one of the things that I didn't really know coming into it, that where Autumn was going to be as far as the second and third albums. I know that she loved the first album because we did an album review on Forever My Lady a couple of years ago. And so I knew that was coming. But, you know, to get her perspective on the other two albums, because it was the three-peat. We talked about all three of those albums, or their first three albums. And but it was dope. But according to Spotify, that was my top episode as far as listeners are concerned. I didn't ask them what the numbers look like. Spotify also said you were streamed in 16 countries. If you're outside of the United States and you listen to this podcast, thank you. Because trust me, other than having a cousin that lives in Qatar, I don't know nobody outside of the United States. So if you're in Japan, if you're in Yugoslavia, hey, shout out to y'all, because I don't know anybody outside of the United States. I don't have any family outside of the United States. I know a couple of cool people in Mexico, but that's about it. And those cool people, if they listen to my podcast, then that's dope because I don't know anybody in Mexico either that would be listening. So to have listeners from 16 different countries listening to the podcast, I think that's super, super dope. Spotify also said your top fans listen to you 3.1 times more than your other listeners. Shout out to the top fans, whoever you are. Again, it doesn't give that particular data as to who those fans are, but I'm appreciative. I really and truly am. It also says you're the number one show. The 12 Kyle podcast is the number one show for 14 fans. So I have 14 super fans. That's amazing. And for some people, they'd be like, oh man, 14, that's it. Listen, you don't understand. I guess I can break it down like this. You don't understand the process of what it takes to, some of you, I'm not going to say all, some of you don't understand the process of what it takes to create and produce a podcast. And you're literally sitting in a place and you're talking to yourself. You're talking into a microphone. You're looking into a camera and you're talking, and you're not, when you finish everything, when you edit it, you put the music together, you upload it, you literally and figuratively have no idea who's going to listen. You don't have any control over who listens. The only thing you have control over is where you place that podcast. That's it. And so to go from that to 14 people saying, you know what? I don't care when it is. Every time this thing comes out, I'm listening. So you're the super fans. For the super fans, I salute you. I appreciate you. If I had $1, I'd give you $1 because it'd only be $14. But yeah, real talk. It is definitely felt. I really appreciate it because here's the thing. The reality is, and I tell people this all the time who want to get into podcasting, don't assume that because you make a podcast, the people in your inner circle, maybe family, maybe friends, are automatically going to listen, because honestly, everybody doesn't listen to podcasts. They don't. Or, you know, some people would prefer to listen to Joe Budden or Joe Rogan or Joe Biden before they listen to your podcast. And, you know, that might be a tough pill for some people to swallow. For me, it's not, because I know that this cloth that I'm cut for, it ain't for everybody. I'm not for everybody, and I'm totally fine with that. I never have been for everybody. I probably won't be for everybody. But for those who rock with me, rock with me. And for those who don't, that's cool too, because I'm definitely not losing any sleep over it. But to you 14 super fans, thank you. It says your podcast rating was a 5. Another thing, I appreciate that too, because you don't anybody can get on there and hate and give you a 4. So, and I never asked for people to rate my podcast, but I definitely appreciate that as well. Like I said, this podcast is going to keep on rolling. What you'll see probably going forward is much of the same. When people always ask me like, well, hey, what do you talk about on your podcast? Whatever I want to talk about. I mean, like I have things that I want to discuss and cut and discover and talk about. But my podcast is called the 12 Kyle Podcast for a reason. It's about me. It's about my thoughts, my experiences, and the people that I come in contact with, and whatever topics that I want to talk about. You guys know I don't do a lot of current topics, but I try to keep it funny. I try to keep it fresh. I try to keep it light, and I just try to give you me. And I think at the end of the day, I really can't ask for much more. Sit tight. We'll be back in just a second, and on the other side of the break, we'll get into the music side. We'll talk about the podcast that I listen to and the music that I listen to on Spotify. Sit tight. We'll be back in just a second. Are you feeling nostalgic for the golden eras of rap and soul music? If so, tune in to the Rap Soul Podcast. We are your weekly journey through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, spotlighting the music and the hidden gems that shape the soundtrack of our lives. From the powerful beats to the soulful melodies, we bring you the best of the past with fresh insights and stories. Rediscover the music that defined a generation. Subscribe to the Rap Soul Podcast and enjoy the vibes. And just like that, we are back. Once again, it's your boy 12 Kyle. This is the 12 Kyle Podcast, and we're wrapping up 2024. Like I said, this conversation is based on the information that I got from Spotify that talks about me and my listening habits, as well as the people that tap into this podcast. So before the break, I told you about, the podcast side as far as what I was listening to and that type of thing as far as the numbers were going as far as this podcast. But let's talk about some of the podcasts that I listened to. According to Spotify, you spent 26,359 minutes listening to podcasts this year. That's a lot. I will say this. I think I probably listened to more podcasts than I did music. I don't think they gave me my number as far as music. If they did, I didn't write it down. But that's cool because podcasts really have given me the break from music. Now I love listening to music, and I'm going to listen to music every day. As you guys know, I'm a huge music head. I'm really not so much into some of the newer music that comes out. I will listen to some, not all. And for some, you got to tell me, yo, it's you go check out this right here. It's dope. And I'll be like, okay, I'll go check it out. Others, I'm just never going to get to it. I'm just never going. Or others, I may listen to it once and I'm never going back to it. Like, it's just, that music just doesn't stick to me like that. But according to Spotify, I listened to 26,359 minutes of podcasts this year. Do you want to know who my top 5 podcasters are? Now, the top 5 podcasts that I listen to, Spotify keeps a track of how many times I've listened to this podcast, these particular podcasts, throughout the course of 2024. If your podcast does not appear on this list, don't be mad. You might want to get your numbers up. No, but seriously, I don't know. I know that they do it by numbers, but here's the thing. Most of the podcasts that I listen to them on Spotify. I don't listen to them on Apple. I subscribe to every podcast on Spotify and Apple because sometimes Spotify is late as far as notifications. Sometimes Apple is late as far as notifications. But I also understand too that even with my podcast, every now and then I'll listen on Apple. but I don't really listen on Apple that much. But I listen to other podcasts on Apple. I'll give you a perfect example, like the homie, my boy Baylor, BTG for President. His podcast, BTG for President, is on Spotify. His other podcast is on Apple. I'm sorry, BTG for President is on Spotify and Apple. His other podcast, the sports podcast, Open Run with BTG, is only on Apple. I listen to that weekly on Apple. Well, I don't have the Apple numbers. So in that instance, Open Run wouldn't make my list. Nonetheless, I will give you the top 5 podcasts that I've listened to in 2024. And then, like I said, they've all been on Spotify. Number 5, Too Much Game. The Too Much Game podcast with my boy Uncle Dolomite. Shout out to Compton. That's the homie right there. Y'all seen him on here. He's been on here a few times. Just hung out with him when I was out in LA a couple of weeks ago. That's my dog right there. I listen to Dolomite all the time. He drops a weekly podcast. Dolomite, I think Too Much Game probably could be a little bit higher if I don't catch his live. What happens is he broadcasts live on Sunday nights, right? And he'll broadcast live on YouTube. But if I don't catch the live, then I'll listen to the audio on Spotify. And sometimes I'll miss part of the live. And if I miss part of the live, I'll just listen to the whole podcast on Spotify. If I watch it on live, then I don't go back and listen to it on Spotify. But it's a dope podcast. Like I said, an episode is broadcast live on his YouTube channel every Sunday, usually around 8 o'clock Eastern Standard, somewhere between 7 and 8 Eastern Standard Time. And that kind of varies, but follow him. That's, like I said, that's the homie right there. Dope podcast. And trust me, you're going to get game. Now he's a billionaire, but and he don't speak down to us, poor peons. Shout out to Uncle Dolomite. Number 4, Brother from Another. That was a sports podcast with host Michael Smith and what's the other guy's name? Michael. Damn, I forgot his name just that fast. 2 Michaels. Their podcast went away, I want to say in September. It was a podcast that was on, you can listen to it on Spotify, but it was also on TV on Peacock. I would watch it on Peacock religiously all the time. And I thoroughly enjoyed it, man. I don't know what happened, but it was on, with NBC. I don't know if the powers that be took them off or whatever like that. They started doing less and less shows together because of traveling and schedules and stuff like that. But big fan of the show. Hopefully they come back in some type of other, iteration of the podcast. But Michael Smith, and I don't know why I'm forgetting other Michael's last name, but I'll think of it in a second. Brother from Another. Like I said, if you go back and listen to their podcast now, obviously it's going to be dated because they were talking about daily topics when it came to sports and culture, particularly Black culture. But yeah, they came in at number 4. Number 3, another billionaire friend of mine, King Germ. Podden Saved Our Marriage is the name of the podcast. It is hosted by my man King Germ and his wife, Queen Germ. They drop a podcast every Friday. Been rocking with this cat. Man, I've been rocking with Germ for 4 or 5 years now. Seems like longer than that. But me and Germ go way back, and they got a dope podcast. I am one of the few. In fact, I was the first. I was the first podcaster to come on their podcast and be a guest. I think I was on episode 12. 12, right? Yeah, I was on episode 12 of their podcast. Love their show, man. Me and Germ, we'll chop it up on the phone at least a couple of times a week. And they talk about a little bit of everything. It's a husband and wife team. They're very, very, very much crazy, but I enjoy the show, and so will you. Check them out every Friday. Again, that's another one that I listen to on Spotify. Number 2 actually probably should be number 1, and that's The Right Time with Bomani Jones. Shout out to Bomani. Bomani's been probably my number 1 podcast that I've listened to over the last 3 or 4 years. And the reason why I say it should be number 1 is because Bomani does 3 shows a week. But here's the thing. Sometimes when his shows drop, well, all of his shows are on YouTube. I think this year I found myself watching quite a few on YouTube and not listening to the audio on Spotify. And that's why his numbers were probably a little bit lower to where they fell to number two from number one. Because if I'm not mistaken, the Right Time podcast has probably been number one for the last 3 years on my Spotify. So yeah, I mean, and again, he does 3 episodes a week. So you do the numbers. Like I'm not competing with that. So, but this year I think I probably watched more of his episodes on YouTube, and thus, that's why he probably came in at number 2. Number 1, no surprise, the 12 Kyle podcast is number 1. I mean, like, did you expect somebody to be? Because I think in years past I would come in at number 2 behind the Right Time with Bomani Jones. Yeah, I mean, like, if you don't listen to your podcast and you do a podcast, like, something's wrong. Like, I'm probably way more critical about my podcast than anybody else ever could be. I'm very anal, if you will. Pause. My bad. Pause. I'm very intentional about the podcast, so I have to listen to it. I could never be in that position where I put it out and didn't listen to it. And when I listen to it, I hear mistakes. I don't listen to hear how good I sound. I'm like, oh man, I should have hit that break, or I could have changed this exchange better, or I could have led into this question a little bit better. And honestly, I'm constantly critiquing myself, and I want to feel myself and understand that I'm getting better. And I think that I am. But it's subtle things, but I know where I have to improve at. And, it's the perfectionist in it. And I don't think, in fact, I know for a fact, I've never created a perfect podcast. Every podcast has some type of mistake in it. They're so small and minute that most of you would not recognize it, but you hear the mistakes. And if you're creative, the mistakes in your art. It is what it is. But yeah, my podcast, the 12 Kyle podcast, comes in at number 1. Now let's get on to the music and the artists that I listen to. This may surprise you, but to be honest, I spent a lot of time, again, listening to music on Spotify. I have my favorites. I have the people that I listen to consistently. I have the songs that I listen to consistently. I try not to repeat music, but I think when I find a good artist or a good song that I like, I'm going to rock to it. So with that being said, let's get on to my top 5 artists according to Spotify as far as what I listen to. Coming in at number 5, The Foreign Exchange. Listen, The Foreign Exchange to me is still one of the best groups and one of my favorite groups ever. I have always been I've been a fan for so long. And this year, I think The Foreign Exchange in 2024, they put out just a couple of songs. Or maybe it was just like 2 songs, I think. And that was it. But I mean, like, I'm always going back to their old music. I don't know that they've made any commitments towards making music for 2025. But The Foreign Exchange is constantly in my top 5 every year on Spotify. It goes without saying, it's one of my favorite groups of all time. They make feel good music, and they haven't missed at all. So I'm always gonna rock with Fonte and Nicolay, The Foreign Exchange, man. Shout out to y'all. Their album, I want to say Connected. I think Connected turned 20 this year. I think it turned 20 in 2024. But nonetheless, they came in at number 5. Number 4, Kendrick Lamar. Listen, Kendrick Lamar probably was the artist of the year in 2024. I mean, what can I say? From his famous battle with Old Boy from Canada to, his surprise album of GNX, getting the nod to perform at the halftime Super Bowl in New Orleans. It was K. Dot's year. I don't think it's a stretch by saying that, but he came in at number 4. Number 3, one half of the Foreign Exchange, my man Fonte. Fonte, I think, is one of the most dope, underrated MCs, singers that you could ever want to be around. Fonte, he put out an EP this year, and the EP was so cold. I ran that up, man. I ran them numbers up, as you can see, because he's number 3 on my list. It was incredible, man. I look forward to more music from Fonte. I got a chance to check out the documentary. As many of you know, Fonte, he's also in the group called Little Brother. Little Brother had a documentary. If you have not seen that documentary, it's about an hour and a half. It chronicles their story from the beginning to right now. His membership in the group, his interactions and love and friendship and everything that he went through with his fellow rapper and fellow group member, the rapper Big Pooh, and subsequently their fallout, if you will, with producer and former member Ninth Wonder. It was no sneak up surprise type stuff here, but it was very compelling, and it's really about a friendship. But yeah, I would ask all of you to check out that. It's on YouTube. It's called May the Lord Watch, which is also the title of Little Brother's last album, which that came out in 2019. So hopefully Little Brother will have more music to come. They did drop a couple of singles this year. So anytime Foreign Exchange, Fonte, or Little Brother drop something, I'm there. I'm a biased fan. I'm a huge fan, but I'm there. Coming in at number 2, as far as artists that I listened to this year, my top artists. This artist didn't even release any new music this year, and he's at number 2. That would be none other than D'Angelo. D'Angelo has stayed probably in my Spotify top 5 for the last 3 or 4 years. The Brown Sugar album, the Voodoo album, those albums get play every month. And it's to a point now where I don't ever listen to Brown Sugar without listening to Voodoo. I don't ever listen to Voodoo without listening to Brown Sugar. And subsequently, if I hear a song from Voodoo, I'll just play it and then I'll start playing the album. If I hear a song from Brown Sugar, I'll play it, then I'll play the album. It's, again, dope, feel-good music. Neo soul to the core, that's me. So yeah, I love it. I love it. So it's not something, again, that I'm D'Angelo hadn't made music in a while. And was it 2014, I think? The last one? Black Messiah, I think that was 2014. So even that's been a while. I'm not sure if that's the right year or not. Don't sue me. I don't have it in front of me. And my number 1 artist also did not make any new music this year, but he was my top artist of the year. That's right. None other than the late Nipsey Hussle. Listen, Nipsey Hussle, I know how Nipsey Hussle became my number 1 artist and most listened to artist of the year. I said at the beginning of the year that I was going to do a deep dive into his catalog. Because here's the thing. I talked about this on previous podcasts. I was very familiar with his music. I had listened to Victory Lap and I'd heard Crenshaw, quite a bit at the time of his death. But outside of Crenshaw, outside of Victory Lap, and outside of maybe one or two other projects and some songs, I've heard songs here and there, lots of songs. I wasn't really familiar with his entire catalog. And at the beginning of the year, I started doing just a deep dive into some of his albums. And I remember distinctly, I got to Bullets Ain't Got No Name Volume 2. And bruh, I was stuck. I was stuck on that album like for a minute. Like it was something that I was playing every day. And the reason being, and there's going to be a Nipsey Hussle There's gonna be a Nipsey Hussle album review for Victory Lap, as well as Crenshaw on this podcast. Excuse me, on the Rap Soul podcast. I'm sorry. But I think one of the things that I wanted to do was, because here's the thing, and I mentioned this on previous episodes, and it's worth repeating. When I heard Victory Lap, like I said, I'd heard Crenshaw several times. I heard Crenshaw, and Crenshaw was still is a smoker. I immediately fell in love with Victory Lap. But the one thing that I kept coming away from Victory Lap saying is, and I told my friends this, I can't pinpoint why this album sounds the way that it does. Now, keep in mind, I heard Victory Lap, when it came out. So I was very familiar with the album, even up until the time that he, tragically left us. But here's the thing. I could not put my finger on why the album sounded the way that it did. So in me going back to the Marathon, Bullets Ain't Got No Name Volume 2, Bullets Ain't Got No Name Volume 1, Slauson Boy. I mean, going back to some of those earlier joints, if you listen and you hear his subject matter, you hear how he's rhyming, you hear what he's rhyming about, for me, I could see where he was growing, and then he hit a point as an artist where it just clicked. And to me, it felt like he just took off from there. And after going back and listening to his entire catalog, I answered the question to myself. That made me realize why Victory Lap sounded the way that it did. Because Victory Lap sounds way more polished. And it wasn't like he was an unpolished MC, because he's not. He is a really, really dope rapper. Really dope. But he drops so many gems in there. And one of the things, and I'll talk about this on the podcast, was like, even Nipsey's affiliation and with the Rolling 60s, he never came off to me as it being something that he would necessarily glorify. Hey, I did it. This is basically what he said. I did it. This is my gang. This is my neighborhood. This is what I represent. And you got to respect me. Pretty much. And it wasn't like it was something that was glorified. He never made it sound like something like, hey, join my gang and we'll come over here and have a good time. It wasn't anything like that. And there was a level of respect that he commanded even in his lyrics. And you could, especially from the earlier work, you could hear his hunger. And the difference was he wasn't, and especially once I heard the book that came out, it's called The Marathon Continues. I'm going to do a review on that as well. I heard about, you could hear and understand and feel the struggle. He went from one place to the next, and he was constantly grinding. So when you hear a song like Grinding All My Life, it makes sense, because if you're familiar with his story, I really wasn't familiar with his day one story. I caught on his story basically midway through his lifetime or lifespan, if you will. But to get early Nip and hear him as a recording artist, some of his first works, was incredible. So yeah, that's how Nipsey Hussle became my number one artist. And when I tell you, I was a fan before I started listening to his music. I'm a huge fan. There's not a lot of time that goes by when I don't listen to something from Nipsey. And it could be a song, it could be an album. And I mean, like, I'll give you an example. Like I mentioned my trip to LA. Man, I don't think I played anything but Nipsey when I was in LA. This Nipsey and Kendrick. That was it. So yeah, so shout out to Nip. The marathon does continue. And like I said, you'll get more about that. But I wanted to explain how and why Nipsey was my number one artist. And last but not least, let's see. The most listened to song. Spotify does tell you what your top song was. So be clear. Everybody has a top listed song that they listen to. And I don't know if they give you the particular numbers. I didn't see the numbers as far as how many times I listened to this particular song. But the number one song for me for 2024 was Not Like Us by Kendrick Lamar. Now, there was a lot of talk about from Drake about the fact that, you know, bots were being used or things like that to drive up the numbers for Not Like Us. That is not true. Drake, I'll be honest with you. It was me. I listened to this song 5,800 gazillion times. I'm to blame for the numbers. I'm the reason why Kendrick Lamar helped crush you in this beef. You don't have to blame Kendrick, just blame me. Seriously, this is my number one song. And I can make a case that it's the song of the year. And I mean, like, it had everybody calling this man a pedophile. The pettiness of the song was just so dope. And if you think that for 1 second that Drake won this battle, I could sell you oceanfront property in Salt Lake City. But nah, he didn't. And I mean, this was Kendrick's year. And to say that the West is back, understatement. The West is more than back. The West is here. The West is here. And the pop out, oh my gosh, the pop out was, I wish the pop out was on Spotify. If the pop out was on Spotify, man, we'd have all kind of crazy numbers. But I said all that to say this. Music wise, it was a great year. Music wise, it was a year to remember. Podcast wise, for me personally, it was a great year. And I listened to a lot of dope podcasts. I know I mentioned who's in my top 5, and those are just based on the numbers. Some people just don't have the volume, to be honest. But, you know, if you didn't make my top 5, trust me, if I'm tweeting it out or if I'm talking to you on social media about your podcast, I'm listening. One thing I can honestly say, I'm very clear about, you know, the podcasts I listen to, and people who know me know when I'm listening to their podcast. Because sometimes I'll ask questions about the podcast. Sometimes there's dialogue about the podcast. I make no secret about that. So all in all, 2024 was a great year. Ultimately, even if 2024 did not bring you what you wanted it to bring you, a lot of us suffered, you know, some hard times. A lot of us suffered loss. We lost a lot of great people in 2024. You know, personally, I lost family members. You know, so even in dealing with that, you have to kind of take it with a grain of salt. But ultimately, I always say, if we got to see the entire year, was it really a bad year? You know, I'm not one to say that, you know, in 2025, you should do this or you should do that. And don't let the changing of a calendar make you feel how you should feel. There's always a level of excitement and enjoyment about a new year. But if you don't change your habits and what you do, you're going to keep getting the same thing that you've been getting. I tell my kids all the time, if you keep doing what you've been doing, you're going to keep getting what you've been getting. And it doesn't matter what it is. If you want to do better financially, if you want to do better health-wise, whatever it is you want to do, set a plan to it. Not just to run to the gym and work out for a couple of days and then be back at home eating bonbons. Take advantage of 2025. Take advantage of every opportunity that you get. More importantly, listen to the music, listen to the podcast, listen to the 12 Kyle podcast. Because at the end of the day, I'm here to give you dope content. And in my opinion, I think in 2024, I did that. That's going to do it for me. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for checking out this edition of the 12 Kyle podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast. You can find the podcast wherever you find podcasts. We're a little bit everywhere. We're also on YouTube. Make sure that you download and subscribe there. Hit the like button. That way you get, and the notification button. That way you get notified whenever we drop episodes. Follow me on social media. We're on Blue Sky. We're on Twitter X, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, TikTok. We're a little bit of everywhere. If you want to contribute to the podcast financially, hit us up on Cash App, $TWELVEKYLE. You can also buy merch. Look in the description box. There's a link that says merch. Click that link. You can buy 12 Kyle Podcast t-shirts, hoodies, as well as coffee mugs for the low. At the beginning of the podcast, I mentioned the Rap Soul podcast. You can find that podcast wherever you found this one. And we're also on social media at the Rap Soul podcast, everywhere this podcast is. So listen, those episodes drop every Monday at midnight. Again, that's going to do it for me. I am your boy, 12 Kyle. This has been another edition of the 12 Kyle podcast. This has been 2024 wrapped up. I'll catch you guys next time. 5,000. Cheer.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of the 12 Kyle podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure that you hit the subscribe button and share this podcast with a friend who needs the 12 Kyle podcast in their life. Every listen, every download, and every share helps us grow. Thanks for being a part of the 12 Kyle podcast community. We appreciate your support. We will catch you next time. 5,000.